Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Carter Seaton, and it's great to have you with us. Today we have two guests, and they just happen to be married, Mesha Maren and Randal O'Wain. Thanks for coming, you guys.
Oh, thanks for having us. Welcome to our dining room.
Yeah, welcome to your dining room, and welcome to my bedroom. Mesha Maren is the author of the novel Sugar Run, published by Algonquin Books, and her short stories and essays can be read in many prestigious literary journals. She was the recipient of the 2015 Thomas Wolfe Fiction Prize, a 2014 Elizabeth George Foundation grant, an Appalachian Writing Fellowship from Lincoln Memorial University, and has held fellowships from the MacDowell Colony and the U-Cross Foundation. She was the 2018-19 Keenan Visiting Writer at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is also an assistant professor of the practice of creative writing at Duke University and serves as a National Endowment of the Arts Writing Fellow at the Federal Prison Camp in Alderson, West Virginia. That's quite an accomplishment, all of those things.
Yeah.
Randal O'Wain holds an MFA from the well-known Iowa nonfiction writing program. He's the author of Meander Belt, Family, Loss, and Coming of Age in the Working Class South, which was published in 2019, and his new book, Hallelujah Station and Other Stories, which was just published by Autumn House Press. He also has written essays and short stories, which have appeared in Oxford American, Guernica, The Pinch, Booth, Hotel America, Story South, among others. Welcome so much to you guys. We know you were scheduled way back, a while back, before the pandemic in person, and then we had to take a little hiatus there and go virtual. Finally, I'm so glad we could finally work it out.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so let's start with you, Mesha. You're a prose writer primarily, and when you teach, is it mostly fiction or nonfiction or both at Duke?
A little bit of everything. So what I've taught so far at Duke have been a combination of, some of my classes have been strictly fiction. And I taught an introduction to fiction class, which was really fun. Last semester, we had to, as everyone else in the world did, finish it up virtually. But even with that, it was a great group, and we had a really nice little reading at the end of the semester. And then next semester, I'm going to do an advanced fiction, but that also really love equally as much teaching what they call Introduction to Creative Writing, which can be formatted in a few different ways. But the way I do it is we do a little bit of nonfiction, poetry. We look at one play, we do a tiny bit of playwriting and fiction.
Okay.
And that class is so fun because even though prose is what I feel like I'm best at writing, but I love teaching poetry.
Fantastic.
And yeah. That's
great. And you teach at the prison in Alderson. It's still a women's prison, right?
It is, yes. And I've taught there and also at the men's prison in Beckley, all through the same program. We both have, actually. Mm-hmm. The National Endowment of the Arts has a really wonderful program that they fund, and then Carnegie Hall in Lewisburg teams up with them and sends writers into both of the federal facilities there in, I guess it's technically in Beaver, West Virginia, and in Alderson.
So do you teach them any kind of writing, whatever they're interested in?
Yeah, what I've basically done for the most part, both at the men's facility and the women's facility, is something similar to the Intro to Creative Writing class that I just talked about at Duke, where it's kind of an overview of many different forms of writing. And then, especially when I was at Beaver, we would often move on to a more advanced class, and that would just depend on who signed up for the class, what they wanted to work on. There was one guy who was working on a really long fantasy novel. Oh, there's our kitty cat. Move along, kitty, kitty. That's Arthur. That's Arthur.
Good job.
And there was even a man in my class up there in Beaver who really wanted to focus on writing. He was a preacher. He wanted to get better at writing sermons. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have experience in that, but I reached out to my brother who did have some experience. We got some books that talked about it. And so it was pretty much driven by what the students were interested in.
Yeah. How about you, Randall? What did you teach them?
Yeah, it was similar. I did 3 units, a unit in poetry, a unit in nonfiction, and a unit in fiction. And I chose, I mean, you have to be very careful with the readings that you choose, but I usually chose pieces that worked around family, the idea of family and home, which is one of my favorite topics of conversation anyway. And I just, with both I taught in the medium security men's prison, and then also at the minimum security women's prison in Alderson. And with both of them, you're really just, well, actually Alderson, being minimum is mostly white collar crimes. And so you have like a range of people, but there are a lot of people who have PhDs already or were CEOs. And that's very different than a medium security men's prison, where a lot of my students were still having, I don't know, issues even coming to the idea of writing, where other students, at Alderson had been in creative writing classes in college. And so there was always this, there's always a balance of like your intentions when you go into the classroom versus like what you can actually do in the classroom. So they would read or they wouldn't read, they would write or they wouldn't write. And so it was always just this kind of balance of letting them use the time in whatever sort of like at peace way that they could, while also trying to teach the ones who are really eager and interested in learning. I think most of the students were just grateful to have some quiet time, because there's nothing quiet about prison.
Right. Do you all find, either one of you find that experience has any overflow, shall we say, to your own writing?
Yes, for me, definitely with Sugar Run, it had some pretty immediate overflow. So when I wrote the first draft of Sugar Run, which for anyone who hasn't read it, follows a woman who has been in prison for 18 years. And most of the book takes place during the summer right after she's been released. And then some of the flashbacks take place before she went to prison, but it centers around her post-prison experiences. And when I wrote the first draft of that book, I hadn't taught in prisons yet. So it wasn't like the idea of the book came from teaching in prisons, but what happened is I'd already written a draft of it, and then I was working on revising it. And the more time that I spent teaching in various prisons, the more little details I felt like I could fill out and make realistic. And it also helped me to be able to feel like I could realistically depict the mental weight of imprisonment. And little things like I taught actually also when we were living in Iowa. I taught at a state prison there, and one of the classes that I was in, one of the guys had mentioned, I just thought I was making small talk before class, talking about the weather and the leaves changing. And he mentioned to me, oh, we wouldn't know because the only time we get to spend outside is in the prison yard and there are no trees there. And something that small was like one of the keys for me to kind of breaking into that mindset of, right, oh yeah, even the changing of seasons, of course they're aware of what month it is, but they don't have those kind of visual cues. So little tiny moments like that, I think, have really affected my writing.
Yeah, I can see that. That novel, Sugar Run is the name of it, for those of y'all who didn't catch it when she said that, has been called hard-boiled fiction, darkly steamy, and a heady adventure. And I would agree with all of that. The character of Jody, can you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah. In my process of writing that book and bringing it out into the world, Jody is the book. I mean, more so than in other things that I've written. That book came to me as the character of Jody, and my whole experience with it was completely wrapped up in her. Even though there are of course other characters in the book, and I care about the other characters in the book and wanted to work really hard to make them full-fledged characters, but it's Jodi's book in my mind, and she kind of came fully formed to me. Ended up, in my mind somewhere probably around 2011, 2012. And that was the first time I had the experience of having a character show up, sort of the way that, somebody might show up at your door and knock on the door and you open it and then start talking to them. Like she really felt to me like a real person who showed up and needed me to hang out with her and then tell her story. So that was at times really fun and at other times exhausting. The story I always tell with my early efforts with Sugar Run is that I tried to put it away. I tried to write it and was struggling and threw out most of the pages I'd already written, and then tried to write it again and was still struggling with it, and decided, you know what, this just isn't working. I'm going to just put it in a drawer. And I was working as a waitress at that point, living in Iowa City. And when I put it away, I started to feel kind of haunted by Jodi. Like, the closest thing I could compare it to is when you have a friend who you owe them a phone call, and you need to check in. They're not having the easiest time, but you just can't find the time, or you don't want to make the effort. And then you start to feel really guilty. And that's how it felt, And so I made a deal with Jodi that I would write her story as best as I could, and I would try to get it published. And if I genuinely put in all of the best efforts I had and it didn't work, then she had to leave me alone. And, luckily it went the route of actually getting published and coming out in the world, but that's the deal I felt like I made with her, is I'll give it my best effort. And then, if I do that and it doesn't work out, then you got to leave me alone.
That's great.
That's pretty cool. The character is gay. Did you make that choice immediately, and would the story have worked if she weren't?
People have asked me that before, and that's one of the things that she came to me with. She came to me as a person who had fallen in love with Paula. Paula is in the flashback, the early sections of the book is a woman that Jodi falls in love with when she's a teenager. And that was deeply a part of her story when I started to get to know her. And so it was never felt like a decision that I made. And I certainly can't imagine the story without that aspect, simply because I think Jodi can't imagine her life without that. It wasn't something that she was aware of until she fell deeply in love with Paula. And then everything else in her life changed. And so, yeah.
Right, one more question about that. You do it in sort of two time frames, like you said, with flashbacks. Was that an original concept, or did that work out as you went through it?
Yeah. So that was kind of a combination of both. The very first parts of the book that I wrote were the flashback parts, the parts that take place in 1988 and 89. And those scenes came to me very, very vividly. And I wrote them. And as I wrote them, they made total sense for me to write in present tense and in these kind of small snapshots. But at a certain point, I realized that wasn't the whole book, that there was a whole nother, even before I knew what had sent Jodi to prison, even before I knew she went to prison, I knew something happened in her life. There was this like big hole in her life. And then that we would meet her on the other side of that. And so there were these very, very vivid snapshots from her teenage years, and then Jodi in her later 30s. And I, as I went along, I kind of realized what happened in there. But that's sort of how it was from the beginning. But that's not to say that it didn't change along the way. I worked really hard with my agent and with my editor to figure out the order of those earlier scenes. And I fought pretty hard to keep them interwoven and to also keep the 1988-89 sections in present tense. It's a little odd. They're written in present tense while the stuff that happens in 2017 is written in past tense. And that was something that was inspired by a writer named Laura Kasischke, who wrote a book called Suspicious River, where she did that technique of the past being in present and the present being in past. And I loved the way that that physically made me feel as I read it. And so that's a bit of a nod to that book.
Interesting. Well, I love the book and your prose and its grittiness and I love Jody, so it's a great story.
Thank you so
Randal,
much.
let's talk about you for a little bit.
I can talk about Sugar Run too. I love it too.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good thing for you.
It is.
Do you primarily write nonfiction?
I go back and forth. So Meander Belt was my first book, and then the next book is a story collection that was written simultaneously.
Oh, wow.
So when I would get stuck or couldn't see the forest for the trees with Meander Belt, I would move over to short stories that were kind of kicking around. And usually I like keep notebooks, but the notebooks are really just to-do lists and ideas for stories. That's it. They don't make any kind of cohesive linear sense. But I would just, anytime an idea would form for a story or a character would form for a story, I'd put it in the journal. So, and then I just finished a novel
Wow, good for
right
you.
now. But then I'm also, I've been using my reading time to research for a nonfiction book about bioluminescence. And so I'm always sort of like working in both. The book on bioluminescence is going to be very much like it's going to be in the sort of lyrical essay realm of creative nonfiction, but it's very much like a nature book. It's going to be about the phenomenon and sort of like the many multifaceted nuances of light and dark and other kind of binaries like that.
Wow.
So I'm always going back and forth. And at Carolina, I teach both nonfiction and fiction too. So I find it to be incredibly refreshing to work in both.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I would get bored with myself if I only worked in one job.
Yeah, I can see that. I've written both fiction and nonfiction, and I've written essays and short stories, and I do a lot of magazine articles. So that keeps me in the nonfiction world as well as, when I'm working on a novel. So it's a back and forth, and I can see that it makes a difference.
Yeah. And I learned a lot actually about fiction through working on nonfiction. Interiority is hard for me in fiction, or it was. It's not so much anymore, and that's because of the essay. You have to have interiority in the essay. The essay is about reflection. So.
Right. So the memoir is really a series of those kinds of interior essays. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely, I've called it an essay collection with the scope of a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I've called it. Yeah.
Right. So the character in that, or you, I suppose, wrote a novel that your father never read. Is this true?
That's very true. Yeah.
What happened to it?
I still
have some copies around.
I think I have 2 copies left. So I was 19 years old and I wrote it in 4 weeks, I think, longhand in these little 25-cent composition books. And then I convinced my roommates and friends to help me type it up. And I went to the library and I got a book on how to collate signatures, for a book, because we didn't have a computer in this house. It was 2000, but we didn't have a computer. And then I collated it at Kinko's. And then my mom sewed the signatures together on an upholstery sewing machine. Yeah, it's a pretty cool artifact. It's a terrible book, as you would imagine.
But it's a cool object.
But it's a cool object, and I was like, as you know from the book, I think that I've sort of surpassed this part of my story. But at that point in time, at 19, I was basically an 8th grade dropout. And so even though I read a lot and went to art museums and experienced so many different sort of dimensions of like education, it wasn't formal at all. So my grammar and spelling, oh, that was just atrocious. Just horrible. And when it was done and people were telling me just like about how horrible it was, because people would say, this is horrible, you know, like, you really need to learn how to spell if you want to write a book. Then I had to spend like all of these years going, damn, they're right. And studying Strunks and White like a crazy person. I went through Strunks and White like 3 times. And then I found this other book called Composition and Style or something like that. It was out of press. It stopped getting printed in like 1950 or something, but it's a great book about sentences with all of these example sentences, the Ciceronian sentence and like all of this other stuff. And I got really obsessed with that, but a lot of it was just the challenge of having, I mean, it's very much like Mesha was saying, even though I was 19 and even though I was even though I didn't know anything about grammar or didn't know how to spell, apparently, I still had the character had taken up residence in my mind, and so had the story. And I thought, like, why not? What would stop me from writing this story? And so then I did. But yeah, my father didn't read it then. He did actually read it though. So I gave it to him that Christmas, and he said, Can I cuss on this show?
Yeah.
Or should I?
Yeah.
You know, and I said, you know, he put it on the top of the TV, and then it just sat there for days, and the more it sat there, the more angry I got at him, and eventually I was like, you know, are you gonna read it? And he said, I'll get your mama to tell me what happens, you know. And I was like, well, I thought you'd read it because I wrote it. And he looked at me with that like look only and disappointed or angry father could, and he stuck his tongue in his bottom lip and he said, I don't read. And he meant it, you know. But then when he was dying, he did read it. I didn't know that. He didn't tell me that. And he was in the hospital on life support, and I went into his room and it was sitting on the nightstand.
Wow.
And it was all dog-eared and stuff like that.
So let's talk a little bit about the process of writing a memoir. Obviously that can be gut-wrenching and painful to go back and remember all of that. Did you struggle with writing that?
Yes. It's interesting when I think about the struggle of writing the memoir, it actually comes much, much later. In the beginning, I was so flooded by the stories of you know, it's about the death of both my brother and my father. So having to go through that, but I was flooded with all of the memories and associations that made me a person, you know, because I was so incredibly connected to these two men.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were really close, and I had not, even though I had left home and moved away and lived in Washington State and not in Memphis, Tennessee anymore, I still was like incredibly connected to them. And so there was a great severing when they died. And I wanted to tell those stories. I felt those stories in my body, you know, in my stomach. And they were getting in my way of writing anything else. Mm-hmm. And so I sat down with them and I wrote, like, you know, a first draft of what would then become Meander Belt. And it was always a struggle with it was always, I don't know if struggle is the right word. It was always a very emotional experience.
Yeah, you, in a way, it's trying to purge yourself of it, and that makes it cathartic.
Yeah, but then I edit it and I edit it and I edit it, and I'm no longer experiencing the emotional connection that I felt in my stomach anymore. I'm only experiencing these memories that were very important to me through the lens of the book. And I remember like after I think you know, it was already contracted with Nebraska, I found this letter from my mom and my parents, and there was no note or anything. It was just an itemized list of their income, because I was 22 and I wanted to go to community college in Oakland, And the advisor said that you could get financial aid through the government if you could prove your parents were poor. And you can't get financial aid through the government until you're 24, or your parents have to be poor. So I had to, my dad had been out of work, and I had to call him and say, can you send me proof that you're poor so I could get help with college? And you can imagine how hard of a conversation that was.
Yes.
So it was just this envelope with that list of their money, with like proof that they didn't have any money. And I didn't think about that, and I didn't think to include it in the book or anything. And when I found it, I just cried like a grown ass man. And I felt so grateful. I felt so grateful to find something and to have that immediate emotional response that I should still be having with everything that I wrote in that book, but that I don't anymore. And so I think the struggle actually came later, because it was as if I mined out that sort of bodily interaction with those memories. And I don't think that's something that memoirs really think about or talk about, but I can't tell. It was a gamble, you know. I can't tell if I like that, or I can't tell if I wanted it, like a complete sort of release from it.
There's one paragraph in here on page like 110, I think, that I really loved. I thought it captured a lot of what you were trying to say here. It says, I waited to feel the gut punch that generally followed hurtful words, but it never came. He was right. I know, I said, but at least I'm trying. When I said it, at least I'm trying, I wasn't thinking about my father at all, but instead how inside out the move made me feel now that my life, all my choices, was without the simple foundation of home. As soon as it came out of my mouth, I knew it could be misconstrued as a dirty jab, a comment meant to dig into the depths of his depression. But it was out there, a challenge, or rather an accusation. You can go to bed any time, he said. Too bad I don't have to listen to you, I said. Jokes were our oldest language for love. Yeah, I think that runs true with a lot of people. They don't have any other way to relate to a parent that they maybe have a bad situation with.
Yeah.
It's cool that you picked that out. That's actually the section that I feel like that sums up the book as well. Every time I would get to that section, I'd be like, this is the book. This is the nugget right here. That's I appreciate that. Thank you.
And it is all about home and not being at home, and how we all sever those ties in one way or another. So I really appreciated that whole essay. It was wonderful. Thank you for writing it. This is for both of you. What's your writing life like? And do you bounce ideas off each other, or edit each other's work, or read to each other out loud? How do you do all of that?
Well, right now we both just finished new books, and so we've been waiting until this academic semester ends to trade books, but that's the first time that's ever happened.
So we've ever matched up timing wise, but we've read everything the other has written, maybe with a few small exceptions of a short story or an essay here or there, since we met in 2006.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So Matt is my
first editor in a way.
Yeah, Matt is my most trusted first reader. And people sometimes ask me, oh, well, when you started dating and then when you got married, like, didn't you, sort of like worry that your partner won't be able to be critical of it anymore? But I actually think it's worked the opposite way. I think that if anything, we probably held back some in the beginning when we were just friends and getting to know each other. And that now, not only does he not hold back, but also we can go straight to the heart of what is wrong, quote unquote, with a piece, because we don't have to sit there and say, oh, this is, we do tell each other when part of it is really good, but I think we both already know that we love each other's writing.
Yeah.
And that's a given.
Sure.
And it's actually really nice to be able to have somebody that I can go to that directly tells me that a part of it isn't working, and whose taste I trust so much, so that even I'm stubborn and I'm not always great at taking advice. And so usually I'll kind of push back, and then a few days pass and then I go, oh no, he's right. It's
Yeah.
always right.
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that you all respect each other's writing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know he would never suggest something that wouldn't work for, like, I respect his opinion, but also I know that he doesn't want to change my work for, some people you would share it with and you might wonder, oh, is this something they're saying because they're doing if I were to write this novel,
Yeah.
I would do this, and we're way beyond that. We know we're never doing that with each other. So it's so good to have that kind of
That's
honesty.
great.
Very
All
true.
right, so tell us about your 2 new books real quickly, and then tell us how we can get your books.
You go first because your book's coming out soon.
Okay. So I have a second novel that's also going to be coming out with Algonquin Books, and we just set a publication date. That'll be not until January of 2022, but I'm actually kind of glad about that because I'm hoping, knock on wood, that COVID will be over or mostly over by then. And that novel is called Perpetual West. And my kind of short tagline for it is that it's a novel about first love, queer identity, and professional wrestling. And it follows,
Wrestling? Oh,
and
that's
professional wrestling, yeah. So it follows 3 young characters in their early 20s on the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico.
excellent. And your book, Hallelujah Station, is out, correct?
Yeah. It just came out in September. Here it is.
Wonderful.
I love this cover.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's gorgeous.
Autumn
And
has the
how do
tree.
people get your books?
They're everywhere. I recommend personally going through bookshop.org because when you go through bookshop.org, you can choose what indie bookstore you want. But you could also order through IndieBound.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the very best way for the small businesses is to go directly to your local bookstore's website. That's 100% absolutely the way I would recommend. And if your local if you don't have a local bookstore, or the local bookstore doesn't seem to have a website that seems to be easy to access, then bookshop.org supports local bookshops. But they're accessible, in other ways too. But that's the way that I.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming. It was wonderful to talk with you.
Thank you so
Carter.
much. This was really fun.
And that'll do us for this time on Chapters, but please come back again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to Armstrong Cable Television for news and views that impact you and your community. Wear a mask, keep your hands washed, stay away from people, and stay safe and well. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.